The NFL has record ratings, record popularity, record revenue, and this Sunday will play Super Bowl 56 inside a nearly $6 billion sparkling stadium just outside of Los Angeles, where the league has successfully relocated two teams after losing both the teams that were there in the 90s, including one of them that was one of the teams that left in the 90s, the Rams, who are playing in the game this weekend at SoFi Stadium. Yet today, when Roger Goodell gave his State of the NFL press conference just outside SoFi Stadium, despite the glorious Southern California sunshine, it seemed like there was a dark cloud hanging over the league's head, and certainly the press conference. A lot of it stemmed from Brian Flores' lawsuit last week, but it is the ongoing dialogue about the NFL and the Rooney Rule. And we had Aaron Solomon from Esquire on this show last week to talk about exactly that with the Flores lawsuit and what people can expect. And here's the deal. The Rooney Rule was put into place in 2003 when Tony Dungy was fired from Tampa Bay and Dennis Green was fired in Minnesota. Two successful black coaches that had good runs that were ultimately fired. Now, in Green's case, the Vikings probably improved their success, although not dramatically after he left. Green got another job and struggled mightily. I think he went 3-22 in Arizona before he was fired. In Dungy's case, the Bucs won the Super Bowl the next year with John Gruden. Dungy went on to Indianapolis and won a Super Bowl with Peyton Manning. It seemed to work out in both cases. But at the time, the reason the Rooney Rule went in is because you had two successful black coaches that lost their job as teams wanted to go to the next step. They weren't satisfied with kind of 500 winning seasons, but not winning at the next level. Similar to what the Titans did here a couple of years ago with Mike Mularkey to Mike Vrabel. Team made it to the playoffs, had a winning record, won a game in the playoffs. But they thought there was more out there for this team to achieve, and they needed to make a coaching change to do it, and they brought in Mike Vrabel. That's what happened back then, and so the goal from the NFL at that point in time, with three black coaches in the league after those two were done, was to put in the Rooney Rule and try to require these interviews to happen, or to require that these interviews happen, that would raise the profile of that would raise the number of black coaches in the league. And then that is extended to coordinators, and it's extended to GM positions. It's been tweaked multiple times. Well, here we are almost 20 years later, and the number of black coaches in the league is 3. There's 5 minority coaches, if you include Robert Saleh of the Jets and Ron Rivera of the Washington Commanders. So it's going to take me a while to commit that to memory, but the Washington Commanders. There are 7 GMs out of the 32, 1 president that's black. Now, the other interesting thing that you have to bring into question here is, what is the appropriate level? What's the number that you would have to get to feel satisfied if you think that there needs to be more? I don't know if there is one. Obviously, some of the harshest critics are saying that it's a league of 70% black players. And so there needs to be more of a representation of that in the head coaching pool. But this is where I was talking about that it gets into really sticky conversations about how you get to that place and what exactly that place is that you're even trying to get to. Because just for example, 7 out of 32 GMs is just shy of 25% of the league. Now, that's way below the 70% of players in the league that are black, but it's also significantly higher than the 13% total population number. So where do you fall there? That's a hard. What's the right number where it has to fit in? Does it have to be 70%? Or does that seem like a representative number for the entire population? Another converse argument there is when you have 70% of players in the league that are black, nobody's ever making the argument, ever, that that's too much, that we have to have more racial equality when it comes to jobs in the NFL in terms of players, because that's an easy thing to judge, right? You look at players and you see how they perform, you see how they run, how they lift, how they do all those things at the combine, and it's a meritocracy. They make it out onto the field. When it comes to hiring, though, a little bit like the draft, but in the draft you're looking at the best of the best and it's obvious in front of you. When it comes to hiring, though, for any job, NFL coach or any other job, it becomes subjective. And when you're a general manager like Joe Shane of the Giants, who hired his co-worker from the Bills, Brian Dable, to be the head coach, you probably get one chance. This is Joe Shane's first chance at being a general manager. He gets to hire a coach to come in with him. If it goes well, he keeps his job probably for a long time, and that's the goal. If it doesn't, he probably gets fired with the coach, and it's all done, and he doesn't get a second chance. So what's he going to do? I mean, number one, first and foremost, my guess is race isn't playing any role in this. My guess is he's hiring the person that he thinks is absolutely the best candidate for the job and to work with him. And yes, maybe Dable had an advantage of that because he'd already worked with him. But isn't that part of Shane's prerogative? Doesn't he get that opportunity? Don't the Giants get that opportunity? And that's where this gets tricky. Because again, the line that Goodell used today was that the opportunity is there because of the Rooney Rule. They're getting the opportunity, but what the NFL needs to figure out is how to get the right outcome. That, to me, gets tricky because by its very nature, if you're trying to determine the outcome, you're messing with the process that is subjective. All 32 teams run autonomously. The owner of the Jacksonville Jaguars, Shad Khan, owes nothing to Amy Adams Strunk of the Titans. As a matter of fact, he's trying to hire a coach, like he just did with Doug Peterson, who's going to beat her team and ultimately win the division and get them to the playoffs and try to win a Super Bowl. And that's his prerogative. So from an NFL mission, you can try to provide opportunity. You can try to educate. You can try to push. And I think the NFL's done that. But now it seems like there's this push to ensure that there will be the right ending. And by right, they mean more black coaches hired. But there is no stated goal of how many that should be. It's just more. And that, again, is where it gets tricky. What is the number that would be satisfactory? And how do you get there in the process without infringing on the subjective rights of an owner hiring, of a GM hiring, and how that plays out? Aaron Solomon, who again was on the program last week with Esquire, he said his hope out of this, and this is from a written piece of his as well, is that the courts will look at the Flores lawsuit, and again, that's yet to play itself out. The NFL calls the legal aspect of Flores' allegations without merit. But the courts will ultimately determine that, and he hopes that when they do, they will determine that the Rooney Rule has to have teeth instituted into it. And by the way, he supported that claim by using a lot of these numbers that we're talking about, that the coaching number is way below the player number and some of those sort of things. It's not clear if that's apples to apples. He thinks it is. Others certainly do. But he wants there to be teeth in the Rooney Rule. And I asked him point blank, what does that look like? And his suggestion was that there should be some sort of a fine associated to the league. Because remember, you can't do it to the individual owner. But there has to be some sort of a metric every year about where the NFL stands. And are they making progress? Did they get to the goal or did they take a step back? And if they take a step back or did not reach the goal, there would be some monetary number assigned to that the NFL would then have to pay out in terms of a fine. It's not really clear who they're paying that to. His suggestion was the NFL would voluntarily do that to one of the NFL's charities. Okay, that's fine. But that's a very challenging way to look at this. I don't know if you can do that. I certainly don't know if the court can go in and take a look at a rule that is nowhere near a law and say that the NFL has to expand the rule to include a fine for itself if it doesn't live up to the rule. The NFL's rule is already more stringent and more forceful to teams to make these types of opportunities available and to eventually hire those coaches than any other league in professional sports. Just is. The question is, how do you get to that next place? And the question ultimately is, if you say that you have to get the right outcome, can you get there in a fair way, or do you reverse the course? College admissions for a long time have used racial standards, and in recent years they have been reversed in some states because they have found that there's actually been reverse discrimination happening when that happens. Noble cause, but the admissions process got tilted through the cause in some places and led to a discriminatory outcome. It led to certain people, most specifically of the Asian community, not getting opportunities that they probably should have on merit. And that is always the question that no one ever wants to ask, but we always have to remember when we ask the next question. When you're talking about getting more people involved, that is a wonderful goal, and everybody should be behind it, and everybody should be educated about it and consider it and talk about it. If you start talking about the next thing of mandating the outcome or pushing in fines for not getting the outcome, you run the risk of turning the table the other way. And I don't know if that's the progress we're looking for either. And that's the tricky thing, is Roger Goodell sat there today trying to answer all those questions, and it's not a question that any one person, Roger Goodell, an owner, me, you, anybody, could answer sitting there this afternoon. It is not an either-or situation. It's not a yes, we want to do this and it'll be done because it's just like that. This is something that takes a long time coming. And I think some of the most important steps the NFL has taken is to do internships, get former players in, even just as training camp coaches, get their feet wet to see if they actually want to do that at the end of their career. To try to push to get more coaches involved at the lower levels, to try to get more coordinators. That's where the Rooney Rule was expanded there. If you increase the pool of talented applicants, you ultimately get the best result. And that's the other thing that you have to look at here is people want to talk about all the players in the NFL that are black versus the coaches. There's no question. There's 70% of the NFL is black. But when you look at all the people that have played football around the country, that is not the percentage. It's nowhere near that. And a lot of times when you look around the league, some of the best coaches never played at the highest level. As a matter of fact, some of the worst coaches were high-level players. You've heard that in the NBA a lot of times, where coaches say when it comes so easily to you, sometimes it's hard to coach up others because you can't coach them to do what you did. So when you look at football, a lot of the guys that you see in some of these positions never were around the game. One of the smartest coaches I've ever dealt with is Arthur Smith, who's the head coach of the Falcons. Arthur Smith was not a high-level player. He worked his way up, worked his tail off from grad assistants to quality control to all those sorts of things up the chain. Stayed through 4 different coaches here in Tennessee, finally got a chance to be an offensive coordinator, and he was brilliant at it. That's a lot of the guys you see in the NFL. There's obviously exceptions, but that's a lot of the guys who are working in the NFL as well. So to say that the only pool that matters that goes into being NFL coaches is the NFL player pool is also short-sighted, because there's a lot of really smart coaches out there that were never athletic enough or didn't weigh 300 pounds or didn't run a 4.3 40 to be in the league and play. There are a lot of factors here that go into making the decision. And it's going to be fascinating to watch what the NFL does. Because when I look at it, whether it's Roger Goodell on that podium today in LA, or whether it's the Giants hiring Brian Dable and not Brian Flores a couple of weeks ago, or the Texans hiring Lovie Smith off their staff, when I look at it, I think the people in the NFL want the best for the NFL. They want this controversy to go away, but they all want what's best for the NFL. They want what's best for their individual teams. And when the Giants hired Brian Dable, I think it's because they thought Brian Dable was the best coach of all the candidates, black, white, brown, whatever. They thought Brian Dable was the best coach. When the Texans hired Lovie Smith, they thought he was the best coach. Just like when Brian Flores was hired in Miami, it had nothing to do with the fact that he was black. It was the fact that they thought he was the best coach. Or when the Titans fired Mike Mularkey to hire Mike Vrabel, they thought he was the coach to take them to the next level. Sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. But in a league that is a multi-billion-dollar business, the thing about it is you only make money as teams. Well, I take that back. You make money off the TV deal. But you make more money by winning. You become successful by winning. And so when these teams are hiring, for whatever position it is, just like when they're drafting, they're hiring for who they think is the best candidate. And they don't always get it right, but they would be really, really dumb to make anything other than who they think can win them the most football games a priority. And that's the thing that as they move forward, they're going to have to deal with, because that should always be first and foremost, no matter how many questions you get. If you're running a league that's about the competitive balance and the competitive integrity that Roger Goodell was talking about. There were so many questions today, and he had no answers, because it's going to be a long dialogue moving forward. It was almost enough to make me feel sorry for Roger Goodell until I remembered he's making $45 million a year. So he can answer all the questions he wants, and he can lead this conversation moving forward. But it's something that all of us, I think, will have to consider as we look at the NFL and maybe other things like education and some of that as well. We'll take a break. When we come back, we're going to switch gears and talk a little Belmont basketball. A huge game tomorrow night for the Bruins within the OVC. That's next. This is SportsLine on News Channel 5+.